In 1975, an engineer walked into a boardroom inside one of America's most powerful corporations and showed his bosses a machine that would change everything. They looked at it, they understood exactly what it was, and they buried it. That decision would take 37 years to fully detonate. This is the story of how Kodak conquered the world and then destroyed itself to protect what it had. The story begins not in a boardroom, but in a darkroom, a cramped, chemical smelling space in Rochester, New York in the late 1870s. George Eastman was 24 years old, a bank clerk by day, and he wanted to take photographs. The problem was that photography in 1877 was absurdly difficult. A single exposure required hauling 50 pounds of equipment. Photographers of that era coated glass plates with wet emulsion, exposed them, and developed them, all before the emulsion dried. You had maybe 10 minutes from start to finish. Miss that window and your photograph was ruined. It was a process for professionals and eccentrics, not ordinary people. Eastman read about a new technique in a British journal: dry plates that could be prepared in advance and exposed later at leisure. He began experimenting in his mother's kitchen at night after his banking shifts. He was methodical, obsessive, and relentless. Within 2 years, he had developed a dry plate formula he believed was commercially viable. In 1880, Eastman leased the third floor of a building in Rochester and began manufacturing dry plates. He was 26 years old and still working his day job at the bank. His total startup capital was a few $100s. He had no formal education in chemistry. What he had was an engineer's mind and a merchant's instinct. The Eastman Dry Plate Company was officially founded in 1881. Eastman's partner was a businessman named Henry Strong, who contributed $500. That investment would eventually be worth more than any sum either man could then imagine. But before the fortune came, a crisis that almost ended everything before it began. In early 1882, a batch of Eastman's plates failed. They simply didn't work. Orders were returned. Reputation was at stake. Eastman sailed to England to trace the source of the problem: a gelatin formula that varied by season. He fixed it, returned the money to every customer, and replaced every defective plate. It was his first lesson in brand trust, and he never forgot it. Glass plates were better than wet collodion, but Eastman wasn't satisfied. Glass was heavy, fragile, and still cumbersome. He wanted something lighter, something you could roll. In 1884, he and an inventor named William Walker developed a system that coated photographic emulsion onto a long strip of paper. It was the world's first roll film. The concept was transformative. Instead of loading one heavy plate at a time, a photographer could now carry dozens of exposures on a single spool. The camera itself could shrink dramatically. Photography was beginning its long journey from the studio to the street and eventually to the hands of everyone. Eastman made one more materials leap in 1889, this one in partnership with a young chemist named Henry Reichenbach. Together, they developed a clear, flexible film base made from nitrocellulose, celluloid. It was transparent, lightweight, and far superior to paper. It was also exactly what Thomas Edison needed for his motion picture experiments. The two men struck a deal that would help give birth to Hollywood. But Eastman's most consequential invention in this period wasn't a material at all. It was a camera. In 1888, he introduced a small black box that came preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures. It had a single button on top. The price was $25, about $700 in today's money. The name was Kodak. The name Kodak was invented by Eastman himself. He wanted something that was short, impossible to mispronounce in any language, and that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. He later said he simply liked the letter K. It felt strong and incisive. So he built a word that started and ended with it. When you finished shooting your 100 frames, you mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. Kodak processed the film, printed your photographs, reloaded the camera, and sent everything back to you. The tagline Eastman wrote himself became one of the most famous advertising lines in American history: "You press the button, we do the rest." That slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest," was not just clever advertising, it was a precise description of a business model. Eastman had figured out something that most industrialists of his era had not: The real money was not in selling the hardware, it was in selling what the hardware consumed. Every camera Eastman sold created a perpetual customer for film, chemicals, and processing. The camera was the entry point, the film was the recurring revenue. This structure, sell the razor cheaply, profit from the blades forever, would later become a template studied in business schools around the world. Eastman arrived at it intuitively, 60 years before the terminology existed. In 1900, Eastman took the model one step further. He introduced the Brownie camera, priced at exactly $1. A single roll of film cost 15 cents. The Brownie was designed and marketed specifically at children. It was a deliberate act of customer creation. Build the habit young, and the customer is yours for life. The Brownie was an instant sensation. In its first year, Kodak sold 150,000 units. Amateur photography, which had been a hobby for the prosperous, became accessible to virtually every American family. People began photographing birthdays, holidays, summer vacations, the rituals of ordinary life. Kodak didn't just sell cameras, it created the family photograph as a cultural institution. Eastman was also building his manufacturing base with extraordinary speed. By the turn of the century, the Kodak Park factory complex in Rochester sprawled across hundreds of acres. It was one of the largest industrial facilities in the United States. Eastman employed thousands of workers, and he treated them, by the standards of the era, remarkably well. In 1911, Eastman introduced a profit sharing program for employees. In 1919, he gave away roughly one third of his personal stock, then worth around $10 million, to Kodak workers. He funded the University of Rochester, MIT, and dental clinics for children across Europe and America. He was an unusual figure, a monopolist with a genuine social conscience. For the first 4 decades of amateur photography, the world was black and white. Then, in 1935, Kodak introduced Kodachrome, a color film of such richness and stability that images shot on it a century ago still look vivid today. It was the product of two musicians turned chemists, Leopold Mannis and Leopold Godowsky, who sold their idea to Kodak after years of independent research. Kodachrome was an aesthetic revolution. Suddenly, photographs looked like memory itself: warm, saturated, alive. National Geographic adopted it. Photojournalists used it. The most iconic images of the 20th century, from the American West to the streets of post war Europe, were captured on Kodak film. The brand became synonymous with photographic truth. The business implications were enormous. Kodachrome required a proprietary development process that only Kodak could perform. That meant every roll of Kodachrome in the world had to come back to Kodak for processing. It was the razor and blades model made even more total. The consumer had no alternative. World War II accelerated Kodak's industrial scale dramatically. The company supplied aerial reconnaissance film to the US military, produced precision optical instruments, and manufactured materials for radar systems. By the end of the war, Kodak had grown into a genuine industrial giant, one whose expertise spanned chemistry, optics, and precision manufacturing. Eastman himself did not live to see the color era he had made possible. He died in 1932 at the age of 77, by his own hand, leaving a note that read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" It was a characteristically precise and unsentimental exit from a man who had spent his life solving problems with maximum efficiency. The post war decades were Kodak's golden age. America was prosperous, mobile, and eager to document itself. Baby showers, little league games, family vacations to national parks, all of it required film. Kodak supplied essentially all of it. By the mid 1970s, Kodak controlled roughly 90% of the US film market and 85% of camera sales. The financial results were extraordinary. Kodak's profit margins on film ran between 60 and 70%, among the highest of any major manufacturer in the world. Film cost pennies to produce and sold for dollars. The processing chemicals and paper added another layer of recurring revenue. Rochester, New York was essentially a company town, and the company was printing money. At its peak, Kodak employed over 145,000 people worldwide. In Rochester alone, 1 in 3 workers had some connection to Kodak, directly employed or working for a supplier or married to someone who was. The company provided health insurance, pensions, and a stability that made it the model of what American industrial capitalism was supposed to deliver. Kodak was also a stock market blue chip of the highest order. It was a component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Institutional investors called it one of the Nifty 50, a group of premium growth stocks that seemed so reliable and so dominant that analysts said you could buy them at any price and hold them forever. It was the kind of confidence that precedes catastrophe. Internally, Kodak's culture reflected its position. It was conservative, hierarchical, and deeply proud. Employees called it the Great Yellow Father, a paternal institution that took care of its own from hiring to retirement. The flip side of that security was complacency. The company had been dominant for so long that challenging its assumptions felt almost disloyal. And yet, inside that very culture of certainty, in a laboratory in Rochester in 1975, a 24-year-old engineer named Steven Sasson was about to build something that would eventually make everything Kodak had built. Every film factory, every processing lab, every roll of Kodachrome obsolete. Steven Sasson was a fresh hire from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute when his manager handed him a small project in the fall of 1974. A new component had come onto the market, a charge coupled device, or CCD, and Kodak wanted to know if it was useful for anything. Sasson was told to find out. He had no idea he was about to invent a new medium. A CCD was a semiconductor chip that could convert light into electrical signals. In theory, if you put one behind a lens, you could capture an image without film at all. The image would exist as data, ones and zeros, stored and retrieved electronically. Sasson assembled a prototype from off the shelf components and Kodak parts. The first version weighed 8 pounds. On December 12, 1975, Sasson captured the first digital photograph. His subject was a lab technician named Joy Marshall. The image was black and white, zero point zero 0.01 megapixels, and it took 23 seconds to record onto a cassette tape. When it was displayed on a modified television screen, it was grainy and crude, but it was real. It was a photograph with no film. Sasson filed for a patent. Kodak received it in 1978, and then presented his invention to Kodak's management. He described what he had built as a filmless camera. The response was not excitement, it was a careful, uncomfortable silence, followed by a question that revealed exactly how management framed the threat. How long before this replaces film? Sasson told them his best estimate, 15 to 20 years. The resolution would need to improve. The storage technology would need to mature. Consumer electronics would need to catch up. 15 to 20 years was simultaneously an honest answer, and for Kodak's management, the wrong answer. It was close enough to matter and far enough away to defer. The project was classified. Sasson was told not to discuss it publicly. The filmless camera, the device that would eventually destroy Kodak, was put in a drawer. Management's reasoning was not irrational, at least not on its surface. Film was generating 60-cent margins on every dollar of revenue. Why accelerate the technology that kills your best business? It was a rational answer to the wrong question. The 1980s arrived, and with them a new competitive threat from a different direction: Japan. Fujifilm, Kodak's primary rival in color film, began an aggressive push into the American market. Fuji's film was comparable in quality and priced lower. Kodak, which had essentially ignored foreign competition for decades, suddenly found itself in a real price war. In 1984, Fuji landed one of the most visible sponsorships in American sports. It became the official film of the Los Angeles Olympics. Kodak, which had been asleep at the negotiating table, lost the deal. Photographs of American athletes winning gold medals would be associated with a Japanese brand. It was a symbolic blow that stung deeply in Rochester. Kodak responded to Fuji not by rethinking its model, but by defending it. It cut prices, improved its own film quality, and lobbied against what it called unfair Japanese trade practices. These were the moves of a company fighting to protect territory, not one thinking about what territory it should be occupying in 10 years. The digital threat was still building quietly in university labs and electronics companies. Sony introduced the Mavica in 1981, an analog electronic camera that stored images on small disks. It wasn't truly digital, but it pointed unmistakably at the future. Kodak watched, commissioned internal studies, and continued selling film. The studies all reached the same conclusion: digital would eventually dominate. The studies were quietly shelved. To be fair, Kodak did not entirely ignore digital. In the mid 1980s, it launched a serious internal effort to develop digital products. It spent billions of dollars over the following decade exploring digital imaging, medical imaging, and electronic publishing. The problem was not that Kodak didn't know digital was coming. The problem was that it couldn't bring itself to let digital succeed at film's expense. This is precisely what the business theorist Clayton Christensen would later call the innovator's dilemma. A dominant company's best customers don't want the new disruptive technology at first. Its own financial incentives punish investment in inferior new products, so it keeps improving what it has, while the disruptive technology improves on its own, until suddenly the disruption is good enough for everyone and it's too late. Kodak was the textbook case, even while the textbook was still being written. By 1989, Kodak's new CEO, Kay Whitmore, was under pressure to chart a new course. The company had grown bloated: 145,000 employees, layers of management, and a cost structure built for a monopoly that was starting to crack. Whitmore's instinct was to diversify. Kodak would move into pharmaceuticals, consumer health products, and electronic imaging. It would become more than a film company. In 1988, Kodak had acquired Sterling Drug for $5.1 billion, dollars, a massive bet on the pharmaceutical business. The logic was that Kodak's chemistry expertise could translate into drug manufacturing. The reality was that pharmaceuticals required a completely different set of capabilities, relationships, and regulatory knowledge. The acquisition was a disaster. By 1994, Kodak sold Sterling at a significant loss. Whitmore was replaced in 1993 by Christopher Steele, who lasted less than a year. Then came George Fisher, the CEO of Motorola, widely admired as one of the best technology executives in America. Fisher's arrival was treated as a watershed moment. The board believed he was the man who could finally transform Kodak into a digital company. Fisher moved quickly. He sold off the pharmaceutical and household products businesses to refocus on imaging. He invested heavily in digital cameras and digital printing. Kodak actually produced some of the early leading digital cameras of the mid 1990s. Technically impressive, reasonably priced. For a brief moment, it looked like the pivot might work. But Fisher's fundamental problem was the same one that had paralyzed Kodak for 20 years. Every dollar Kodak made from digital cameras was a dollar taken from the film ecosystem. Selling a digital camera meant someone wasn't buying film. The company's internal incentives, its sales force, its retail relationships, its entire profit architecture pointed in the opposite direction from the future Fisher was trying to build. There was also the patent question. Kodak held hundreds of digital imaging patents, including the foundational patents from Sasson's original 1975 invention. For a time, licensing these patents generated significant revenue, which perversely reduced the urgency to compete directly in digital products. The patent royalties were another reason to move slowly. And slow was exactly the wrong speed for the 1990s. While Kodak was reorganizing, acquiring, divesting, and studying, the rest of the technology world was moving with ferocious speed. The personal computer was becoming universal. The internet was arriving. Consumer electronics prices were collapsing. The resolution of digital cameras was improving every 18 months, roughly in line with Moore's law. The clock was running. By 1995, consumer digital cameras were appearing from Sony, Canon, Casio, and Nikon. They were expensive. The first mass market models cost $600 to $1,000, and their image quality was clearly inferior to film. But they were getting better, visibly, every year. And they had one overwhelming advantage that no amount of film quality could match: immediacy. You could see your photograph right now. Film sales in the United States peaked in 1999 at roughly 800 million rolls. That number, in retrospect, marks the edge of a cliff. The following year, digital camera sales began to accelerate sharply. The crossover, The moment when more photographs were taken digitally than on film was only a few years away. Kodak's core product was about to enter freefall. Kodak's revenue in 1996 was $15.9 billion. Dollars. The stock was trading near its all time high. On the surface, the numbers looked strong, but a careful analyst could see the warning signs. Film volume was flattening, pricing power was eroding, and the capital investment required to remain competitive in digital was enormous. The fortress was impressive, and it was surrounded. George Fisher left Kodak at the end of 1999 frustrated. He had made progress, digital revenues were growing, but the transformation was too slow and the organization too conflicted. His successor, Daniel Karp, inherited a company that was still enormously profitable on paper and deeply dysfunctional in practice. The 2000s would not be kind. The year 2000 was the turning point that Kodak's engineers and strategists had been predicting for 2 decades. Digital camera sales in the United States crossed 1 million units annually and began to accelerate dramatically. By 2001, they crossed 3 million. By 2003, they crossed 15 million. The speed of adoption was faster than almost any consumer technology in history. And as digital cameras proliferated, film rolls disappeared from shopping carts with the same speed. US film sales fell from 800 million rolls in 1999 to roughly 200 million by 2004. In 5 years, three-quarters of Kodak's core market had simply evaporated. The product that generated Kodak's 60% profit margins was becoming a niche item. The financial impact was brutal and immediate. Kodak's net income, which had reached $1.4 billion in 1999, went negative. The company lost $408 million in 2001. It lost money again in 2002. Layoffs began, first in the thousands, then in the tens of thousands. The Great Yellow Father, the company that had guaranteed Rochester a middle class life for a century, was laying off its children. In 2003, Daniel Karp announced a dramatic restructuring. Kodak would exit the traditional camera business in North America and Europe entirely. It would slash its workforce by 15,000 jobs. It would stake its future on consumer digital cameras, digital printing, and commercial imaging services. The announcement was framed as a bold pivot. In retrospect, it was too late by nearly a decade. Kodak actually did reach a number one position in US digital camera sales in 2005, briefly. Its easy share line was genuinely competitive, but the margins on digital cameras were catastrophically lower than on film. Where film earned 60 cents on the dollar, digital cameras earned pennies. Volume couldn't compensate. Kodak was selling more cameras and making far less money. The deeper problem was that the smartphone was arriving. In 2007, Steve Jobs unveiled the iPhone. It was not marketed as a camera, but it had one built in. Within 3 years, iPhone photographs would outnumber photographs taken on dedicated digital cameras. Kodak's pivot to digital cameras was running directly into a world where the camera was disappearing into the telephone. The human cost of Kodak's collapse was concentrated in one place: Rochester, New York. At its peak, Kodak had employed 60,000 people in the Rochester area alone. That number fell to 40,000 by 2000, to 25,000 by 2005, to fewer than 7,000 by 2012. Every layoff wave sent ripples through the regional economy: mortgage defaults, empty storefronts, school budget cuts. Rochester had been one of the most prosperous mid-sized cities in America for most of the 20th century. Its per capita income, its school system, its cultural institutions, all of it was built on Kodak's success. The University of Rochester, Eastman School of Music, Memorial Art Gallery, George Eastman's philanthropic legacy was woven into the fabric of the city. Now that fabric was tearing. The pension obligations made the collapse even more painful. Kodak owed retirement benefits to tens of thousands of former employees, people who had given their careers to the company in exchange for lifetime security. As the company's finances deteriorated, those obligations became an enormous burden that accelerated the financial spiral. Former Kodak engineers and chemists watched with a particular kind of anguish. Many of them had spent their careers working on digital imaging. They knew how good the technology was. They had helped build it, and they had watched the institution they loved fail to deploy it. It was a grief that mixed professional regret with something closer to betrayal. Antonio Perez became Kodak's CEO in 2005 and would be at the helm for the final collapse. A veteran of Hewlett Packard's printer business, Perez believed the future was in printing, specifically consumer inkjet printing. His logic was that people would always want physical photographs, and if Kodak could dominate home photo printing, it could rebuild the recurring revenue model that film had provided. Kodak spent hundreds of millions developing a line of consumer inkjet printers that used lower cost ink than competitors, particularly Hewlett Packard, whose ink prices were famously high. It was a genuine value proposition, but the timing was tragic. The market for home printed photographs was itself collapsing, as people shifted to sharing images digitally rather than printing them at all. Meanwhile, the smartphone camera was destroying not just Kodak, but the entire dedicated camera industry. By 2010, the iPhone 4 could shoot 5 megapixel images good enough for any personal use. Instagram launched that year, and suddenly the photograph had a new destination, a social network, not a picture frame. The word Kodak moment, which had defined personal photography for 3 generations, was becoming a historical artifact. Kodak also held one remaining asset of enormous value, its patent portfolio. Over a century of innovation, it had accumulated thousands of patents covering core aspects of digital imaging, the way cameras captured, stored, and processed images. As revenues collapsed, Kodak became increasingly aggressive about licensing these patents and suing competitors. It sued Apple and HTC in 2010. It sued a dozen other companies. The patent business became a survival strategy. But litigation is not a business model. The patent revenues, while real, were unpredictable and finite, and the perception of Kodak as a litigant rather than an innovator confirmed in the minds of investors and partners that the company had run out of ideas. A company suing the future is not a company with a future. On January 19th, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the Southern District of New York. It was one of the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. The company that had been worth $31 billion at its peak, that had been the envy of American industry for a century, was seeking protection from its creditors. The filing listed $6.8 billion in assets against $6.8 billion in liabilities. Kodak had roughly 47,000 employees at the time of the filing, down from the 145,000 peak, but still a vast number of people whose health insurance, pensions, and paychecks were suddenly uncertain. The news ran on every front page in America. The bankruptcy proceedings would drag on for nearly 2 years. Kodak sold its consumer and commercial film businesses. It sold its document imaging division. Most significantly, it auctioned off its patent portfolio. That crown jewel of 100 digital imaging patents for $527 million dollars to a consortium of technology companies that included Apple, Google, and Microsoft. It was a fraction of what many analysts had predicted the patents were worth. In September 2013, Kodak emerged from bankruptcy as a dramatically smaller company. It had shed its consumer photography businesses entirely. It was reborn as a commercial printing and packaging company, serving businesses, not individuals. The yellow film boxes that had lined the shelves of every pharmacy and grocery store in America were now someone else's product. Fujifilm, Kodak's great rival, charted a different course. It had faced the same disruption, the same collapse of film demand, but Fuji had used its chemical expertise to pivot into pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, and medical imaging. By 2012, while Kodak was filing for bankruptcy, Fujifilm was profitable and diversified. The comparison is impossible to avoid and impossible to be comfortable with. Steven Sasson, the engineer who had built the first digital camera in 1975, was awarded the National Medal of Technology and Innovation by President Obama in 2009, 3 years before his employer went bankrupt because of the technology he invented. He received a standing ovation at the ceremony. Back in Rochester, the factories where Kodak film had been made were falling silent. Let's look at what happened to Kodak shareholders, because this is ultimately a story about capital allocation and trust. Kodak stock traded at roughly $90 per share in 1997. By 2004, it had fallen below 30. By 2011, it was below $1. The total destruction of shareholder value over those 15 years exceeded $25 billion. dollars. People who held Kodak in their retirement accounts, who trusted the Nifty 50 logic, lost almost everything. The bondholders fared somewhat better in the bankruptcy proceedings, but still took significant losses. The pensioners, the retired workers who had given their working lives to Kodak, faced cuts to their health benefits and anxiety about their retirements. The PBGC, the Federal Pension Insurance Agency, had to step in to cover a portion of Kodak's pension obligations. The irony embedded in the numbers is almost unbearable. Kodak invented digital photography. It held the patents. It had the brand, the distribution, the talent, and the capital to dominate the digital era. It had a 15 to 20-year runway from the moment Sasson showed management his prototype. It had every advantage, and it still lost. Analysts and business school professors have spent years arguing about precisely why Kodak failed. The most common answer is it was too slow to embrace digital. But that framing is too simple. Kodak invested billions in digital. It built competitive products. The real question is not whether Kodak saw the future. It did. But why seeing it clearly wasn't enough? The deeper answer has to do with what economists call path dependency. Kodak's entire organizational structure, its incentive systems, its capital allocation processes, its management culture, its relationships with retailers and labs was optimized for film. Every resource allocation decision, large and small, was filtered through the question of what's best for film. Digital was always asking people to work against their own interests. There's also the question of what Kodak's management actually believed. Internal documents and testimony from former executives reveal that many of them genuinely believed the transition to digital would be slower and less total than it turned out to be. They expected film to coexist with digital for decades. They were wrong. Not because they were foolish, but because the pace of consumer technology adoption in the 1990s and 2000s exceeded almost every projection. The decision to shelve Sasson's invention in 1975 is the most cinematic moment in the story and the most frequently cited, but it may be somewhat unfair as the definitive cause. A 0.1 megapixel camera was not a threat to anything in 1975. The real failures happened in the 1980s and 1990s, when digital cameras from competitors were clearly improving and Kodak's responses were too timid, too conflicted, and too subordinated to the film business. Management theorists point to a specific failure of leadership. Kodak needed a CEO willing to actively cannibalize the film business before someone else did. That requires a kind of institutional courage that is extraordinarily rare. Telling your board, your shareholders, and your employees that you are going to deliberately destroy your most profitable product line in order to build something better. Intel's Andy Grove did something like it with memory chips in the mid 1980s. Kodak never found its Andy Grove. For investors, the Kodak story is one of the most instructive case studies of the 20th century. The first lesson is about moats. Warren Buffett coined the term competitive advantages that protect a business like a moat protects a castle. Kodak appeared to have an impregnable moat. Brand loyalty, manufacturing scale, retail distribution, and patent protection. But the moat was dug around the wrong castle. The moat protected film. And film was not the business, photography was the business. When digital technology could satisfy the underlying human desire to capture and preserve memories, Kodak's moat became irrelevant. For investors, the lesson is to ask not what protects a company today, but whether the thing being protected is the thing customers will want in 10 years. The second lesson is about monopoly profits as a warning sign, not just a reward. Kodak's 60% margins on film were extraordinary, and they were a signal of vulnerability. When a business earns margins that high on a product, it means the product is so good and so dominant that competitors and substitutes are being held at bay by sheer market power. Those conditions never last. The higher the margin, the more powerful the incentive for someone to find a way around you. The third lesson is about the danger of size and success itself. Kodak at its peak was too large, too profitable, and too admired to change itself. Its employees had too much to lose. Its shareholders demanded margin maintenance. Its managers were rewarded for protecting what existed, not for building what didn't. Large successful companies develop an institutional immune system that attacks disruptive ideas. The fourth lesson is about geographic concentration, the Rochester problem. When a company becomes the economic foundation of a single city or region, it takes on obligations beyond profit maximization. Those obligations to employees, to pensioners, to the community make it even harder to make the ruthless decisions that disruption requires. Stakeholder obligations and strategic flexibility are in tension, and Kodak shows what happens when you can't resolve that tension. For business leaders, the Kodak story is a meditation on the specific courage required to lead transformation. The technical knowledge was present at Kodak. The financial resources were present. The intelligence was present. What was absent was a willingness to make customers of a highly profitable product uncomfortable, to reassign resources from what was working to what might work, to accept near term pain for long term survival. That willingness has to come from the top and it has to come early. Today, Kodak still exists, technically. The post bankruptcy company is headquartered still in Rochester, employing a few thousand people in commercial printing, packaging, and advanced materials. It is a functional business, quietly profitable in some quarters, utterly removed from the mass market consumer world that once made it one of the most recognized brands on earth. Kodak Park, the massive industrial complex where Eastman's dream was manufactured, has been redeveloped as a mixed use business campus called Eastman Business Park. Startups, small manufacturers, and arts organizations lease space in the buildings where Kodachrome was once made. It is an attempt at reinvention that George Eastman himself might have recognized, pragmatic, forward looking, and unsentimentally focused on what comes next. The Kodak name, the Kodak brand, the Kodak logo, these retain a recognition level that most companies would pay billions to acquire. Surveys consistently show that older Americans in particular respond with warmth and familiarity to the name. It carries with it an entire emotional vocabulary: childhood vacations, family holidays, the particular quality of light in a Kodachrome slide. That's real value. But value in memory is not value in the market. Film itself has not entirely disappeared. There is a small but durable market for analog photography, professional photographers, artists, and nostalgic enthusiasts who prize the grain and warmth of silver halide images. Kodak relaunched Ektachrome slide film in 2018 to genuine excitement in that community. It is a niche, but it is a real one. The great wheel turns slowly enough that the thing you buried sometimes comes back. Steven Sasson, the engineer who built the first digital camera, is retired. In interviews, he has been generous and measured about his former employer, careful not to assign blame too simply, acknowledging that the decisions Kodak made were understandable in context, even if they proved fatal. He invented the future in 1975. He just couldn't make the institution he worked for live in it. George Eastman built his company on a simple insight. Most people don't want to develop their own photographs. They want to press the button. They want the result. The process in between, the chemistry, the mechanics, the infrastructure, was something they were willing to pay for gladly as long as it worked. Kodak owned the process, and it confused owning the process with owning the desire to capture a moment, to preserve a face, to hold time still for just a second. That desire is as old as human consciousness. It did not go away when film disappeared. It intensified. The proof is in your pocket right now. The average American takes more photographs today in a single week than their grandparents took in a lifetime. Kodak's market didn't shrink, it exploded. Kodak just wasn't in it anymore. The story of Kodak is not ultimately a story about technology or strategy or even greed. It is a story about the extreme difficulty of seeing yourself clearly when success has been telling you for a century that you're right. It is a story about what institutions owe the people who depend on them and how those obligations can become chains. It is a story about how the thing that makes you great can become the thing that destroys you. On January 19th, 2012, when Kodak filed for bankruptcy, about 380 billion photographs had been taken in the previous year. Almost none of them were on Kodak film. The company that had taught the world to photograph itself died in the middle of the greatest photography boom in human history. There is no cleaner summary of strategic failure than that single fact. George Eastman's note said, "My work is done." For the company he built, the work was also done. Not finished, but done. The century of the Kodak moment was over. What remained was what always remains: the photographs themselves, fading slowly in albums and attics across America, frozen in the particular colors of Kodachrome. Evidence that something extraordinary was once built here, and that someone once pressed the button.